I'm going to talk about the map. It's a little bit similar to things you've seen before, and some of this is brand new. And some of the material I'm covering today is going to help you with your vocabulary and your different religious groups. So, I'm going to begin with a map of the United States from the perspective of somebody who's from Texas. That if you are from Texas, you have the perception that it is the most important place in the whole wide world, and everything else is just kind of, this West Coast is inhabitable. It's all gone. Washington, you got Missouri, Illinois. It's a different worldview if you look at it from the perspective of somebody who's from Texas. This is not the map that's going to be on the test. This map is not going to be on the test either. It is a wonderful map from the New American Bible, the color version, and it has way too much detail. Too many rivers, too many cities, very, very complicated borders. I want to build what's called a social map. I want you to understand the way in which people in the time of Jesus would have perceived the world they lived in. Specifically, how did Jewish people in the time of Jesus see the world? I already did Flip 19 that talked about the different religious, political, social groups of Jews and their differences between each other, but I also want to talk about it from a geographical standpoint. So, first, label the bodies of water. And for these, I want you to know why they're important in the New Testament. We're going to start talking about the Jesus guy soon, and understanding what kinds of events took place here is important. The Mediterranean Sea is the wave-ridden coast over here on the west. It does not play any part in the ministry of Jesus. However, after Jesus dies and rises, the Mediterranean basically becomes the roadway through which the gospel is spread to the whole world. I use whole world in air quotes there. It spreads throughout Europe and Asia Minor and North Africa. And the reason why the gospel is able to spread so quickly is, one, the Romans are in control of the land, and there is good roads. There's peace throughout most of the Roman Empire, at least relatively peaceful. And these waterways of trade allow the gospel message to spread very quickly. The little round body of water here is the Sea of Galilee, about 500 feet below sea level. And then the Jordan River meanders wiggly all the way through the Jordan Valley to the Dead Sea, which is more than 2,000 feet below sea level. And you should know these things already. Make a nice full-size map, a hand-drawn one, so you can fill in the places and also write down what's important about each of those places. I'm going to put the little city of Jericho there. You don't need to identify that, but let's go back to Moses. They come into the promised land from the desert. Moses climbs Mount Nebo, looks over the promised land, and then dies. Then they conquer Jericho, and so that's always a nice starting point to kind of place us geographically. In the time of Jesus, if you were Jewish, the place to be was Judea. That's where the word Jew comes from. Remember that the 12 tribes split in two. The 10 northern tribes were conquered by the Assyrians and sent off into exile and disappeared. And from then on, the only tribe left was the tribe of Judah. In Judea is Jerusalem. Again, I'm not going to ask you to identify where the city is, but understand that the temple in Jerusalem, originally built by Solomon, rebuilt under Ezra, rebuilt again under King Herod. This is the focal point for Jewish worship. This is where you would go at least once a year to offer a sacrifice. And this was the political capital. It was the economic capital, and most importantly, the religious capital of the Jewish world in the time of Jesus. The little town of Bethlehem is just south of Jerusalem, the city where David was born, and according to the Gospels, or the two Gospels that have baby Jesus stories, that's also where Jesus is born. I want to talk about another area. Jesus actually is from Galilee, a little town called Nazareth. The Gospels are clear that he grows up there and begins his ministry there. One of the Gospels has his family moving up there after he's born. The other Gospel implies that they were originally from Galilee and just traveled to Bethlehem for a census. The area of Galilee and the area of Idumea that I will speak about briefly in a moment were areas that were converted to Judaism forcibly. When the Greeks came in and took over the empires of Assyria, Babylon, Persia, the way that the Greeks tried to control their empire was to make everybody Greek, make everybody speak Greek, adopt Greek culture, Greek religion, Greek language. And the Jews revolted against this. The Maccabees revolted against this. And the Maccabees were actually successful in kicking out the Greeks from their territory. I'm oversimplifying this. I'm not talking about the Seleucids and the Ptolemies and all this complex stuff, but for our purposes in the class, the Jewish leaders, the Hasmoneans, rebel against the Greeks and drive them out and establish a Jewish independent state. And after they did that, they forcibly converted people in this upper area right here, this area called Galilee, to become Jewish. The book of Maccabees actually talks about them forcibly circumcising children and making people become Jews. If that seems tragically ironic, I understand that. They had resented the fact that the Greeks forced them to become Jews. They resented the fact that the Greeks tried to force them to become Greek, yet here they were forcing people to become Jews. So the Galileans were kind of treated as second-class Jews. They were Jews, but they came later to the party. And the fact that Jesus comes from Galilee and that Jesus preaches in Galilee, these are the kinds of cities he would have preached in, Caesarea Philippi and Capernaum and Magdala. The fact that Jesus is from Galilee leads to people resisting whether he's really a Jewish Messiah. Another area that was also forcibly made Jewish during the Maccabean period was Idumea, the former kingdom of Edom. And Herod the Great, the king of the Jews, was from Idumea. And again, Jews didn't always accept him as being a really Jewish king because he wasn't from Judea, he was from Idumea. That's actually one of the reasons why Herod renovated the temple, was to kind of prove to people that he was really Jewish. Down here in Idumea, again, no cities required in the test, is Qumran. This is a monastery out on the Dead Sea where the Essenes lived. The Essenes were a Jewish sect that believed that the end of the world was coming, and they would ritually purify themselves, baptize themselves for the end of the world. They had this very radical apocalyptic eschatology that thought that the world was coming to an end. Don't draw hard borders between these places because there's some overlap and there's some gaps between these. So drawing lines doesn't really help, but understanding the basic geography. The Decapolis is across the Jordan River, or across the Sea of Galilee from the area where Jesus grew up. And so if the Galilee is here, where Jesus does most of his ministry, he actually ends up preaching in the Decapolis as well, because his friends were fishermen, and one of the ways he got around from place to place was in fishing boats. And so Jesus actually preached in this area. And what I'd like you to know about the Decapolis is that it is a Gentile region. And please spell it correctly, Gentile. These were non-Jews. This area was established when the Greeks took over the area. They built cities. They had a lot of Greek culture, a lot of Roman culture. So you would have very, very Jewish people here. People from Galilee and Idumea were Jewish, and although other Judeans looked down on them. And then you had a lot of foreigners, or Greeks and Romans, living in the Decapolis. although there's a lot of intermixing between the different peoples. Obviously, there's Roman troops stationed in Jerusalem, and you've got a guy like Jesus preaching in the Decapolis, and there's a lot of influence back and forth. One area that if you are Jewish at the time of Jesus, you would almost want to forget about is this area called Samaria, that these people shared a similar or common religion with the Jews, but the Jews hated them. The Assyrians, as I noted, had taken the northern tribes off into exile, or most or many of the people of the northern tribes, and then they brought in foreigners, and those foreigners intermarried with and adopted the religion of the people of the north. And the Jews never really accepted them as true Jews. They hated them. And in response, the Samaritans hated the Jews as well. And as you can imagine, there's a geographic problem here, because if you want to travel from Galilee to Judea, you are going to pass through Samaria. Although there were people who would be happy to cross the Jordan River, walk in Gentile territory, because at least they know they're Gentiles, and then come back through here in order to avoid even stepping foot in Samaritan territory. So the fact that Jesus, at least in John's Gospel, travels through Samaria, and in other Gospels speaks favorably about Samaritans, the story of the Good Samaritan, or the story of the 10 leper, where it's a Samaritan who shows gratitude. If you understand the dynamics of a Galilean person marching to Judea and passing through Samaria, there's a lot of historical and emotional and religious baggage here. So I hope that helps you understand this as a social map. If I could go a little further and compare this maybe to the cafeteria at a stereotypical movie high school. And I pointed out before that students at Central Catholic tend to group themselves at tables according to their different social or sports groups or geography. So if I can play pretend with you for a moment, let's pretend that you sit at a table with your fellow skaters. You're all skateboarders, and you see yourselves as the in crowd. There might be people that you let sit at your table. They're not really skaters. They wear the skater clothes, but they admire you, and you kind of look down on them, but you let them sit at your table, but they're not as cool as you are. And then there's people that you don't want sitting at your table, and they want to sit at your table, and they think they're skaters, and you don't think they're skaters, and you actually resent them, and that leads to them resenting you. And then, of course, there's other tables that you don't even think about too much. There's the lacrosse players, or there's the hockey players, or there's the field hockey team, and you don't really think about them much. So you're the cool people, and then these people are kind of cool but not as cool, and then these people are totally not cool, and they think they're cool, and these people, well, they're just somebody else. That might give you a perspective on how Jewish people in first century Palestine might perceive other groups. And if this seems a little bit bigoted, if this seems a little narrow-minded, let me push this a little bit further. And I've been doing this for 4 or 5 years, that there are people in the United States who see themselves as real Americans. They are real Americans, and this is what it means to be real Americans. And then those are the people that they're Americans, but they're not really Americans because they're people that we just brought in to do certain things for us. We enslaved people or imported cheap labor from other places, and they're still never really accepted. And then there's people that want to be here. They would like to be Americans, and we don't want them here. We want to keep them out and resent them. And then there are the people that we just don't think about, those foreigners who have a different way of life. So, hope this was helpful. Talk to you later.